You are standing in the grand throne room of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. The year is 1700, and you are witnessing the end of an empire. Before you sits a man so physically and mentally broken that he can barely hold his own head upright. His jaw juts forward so grotesquely that he cannot properly close his mouth, causing him to drool constantly onto his elaborate royal robes. His tongue is so swollen that speech is nearly impossible, and when he does manage to utter words, they come out as incomprehensible mumbles that his courtiers pretend to understand. This is Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, and as you look upon his twisted form, you are seeing the final result of 2 centuries of the most systematic destruction of human genetics ever undertaken by a royal family. Charles cannot choose solid food. He cannot father children. He can barely walk without assistance. And in just a few months, his death will plunge Europe into a devastating war that will reshape the continent forever. But Charles is not a monster. He is a victim. A victim of a family so obsessed with keeping their bloodline pure that they turned their children into genetic catastrophes, generation after generation, until they produced this broken shell of a man who represents the ultimate price of royal inbreeding. What you are about to hear is the true story of the Habsburg dynasty, a tale of power, paranoia, and the systematic sacrifice of human beings on the altar of genetic purity. This is not the sanitized version you learned in history class, where the Habsburgs are remembered as great patrons of art and architecture. This is the story they tried to hide, the story written in the twisted spines and malformed faces of children who never asked to be born into this nightmare. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Habsburg story begins not with cruelty, but with ambition. In the 13th century, they were nothing more than minor nobles, controlling a few castles in what is now Switzerland. But they had something that would prove more valuable than armies or gold. They had a strategy. While other royal families fought wars to expand their territories, the Habsburgs would marry their way to power. Their motto became famous across Europe. Let others wage wars. You, happy Austria, marry. It sounded romantic, almost noble. But what it really meant was that the Habsburgs viewed their children not as individuals with hopes and dreams, but as genetic chess pieces to be moved around the board of European politics. Every marriage was calculated, every child's future predetermined from the moment they drew breath. The strategy worked brilliantly at first. Through careful marriages, the Habsburgs acquired vast territories across Europe. They became Holy Roman Emperors, kings of Spain, rulers of the Netherlands, masters of territories stretching from Austria to the Americas. By the 16th century, it was said that the sun never set on Habsburg lands, but success bred a dangerous obsession. The more territory they acquired through marriage, the more convinced they became that their blood was special, blessed, superior to that of other noble families. They began to see themselves not just as rulers, but as a chosen people whose genetic heritage was too precious to dilute with foreign blood. This is where the nightmare began. Instead of continuing to marry into other royal families across Europe, the Habsburgs started marrying each other. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, brothers married sisters-in-law. What had started as a brilliant political strategy slowly transformed into a genetic death spiral that would consume the family for the next 200 years. The first signs of trouble appeared in the children of Maximilian I, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire at the turn of the 16th century. His son, Philip the Handsome, was indeed handsome, but he died mysteriously young at just 28. His daughter, Margaret of Austria, suffered multiple miscarriages and was never able to produce living heirs, despite 3 marriages. Court physicians whispered about strange ailments and unusual physical characteristics, but the Habsburg family dismissed these concerns as the price of greatness. Philip's son, Charles V, seemed to prove that Habsburg genetics were still strong. He became the most powerful ruler in European history, controlling territories on 4 continents, and commanding resources that dwarfed those of any previous monarch. But even Charles showed subtle signs of the genetic damage that was accumulating in the Habsburg bloodline. His jaw protruded slightly, a characteristic that would become more pronounced in each succeeding generation. He suffered from gout and digestive problems that his physicians couldn't explain. Most tellingly, despite his vast power and multiple wives, he struggled to produce healthy heirs. Charles's son, Philip II of Spain, inherited the largest empire in human history, but he also inherited something else. The first clearly visible signs of Habsburg genetic deterioration. Philip's jaw jutted forward more noticeably than his father's, giving him a perpetual look of arrogance that actually reflected a physical deformity. He spoke with a slight lisp caused by the misalignment of his teeth, and he suffered from chronic health problems that left him weak and frequently bedridden. But it was Philip's approach to marriage that truly accelerated the Habsburg genetic collapse. Convinced that the family's recent struggles with producing heirs were due to contamination from foreign blood, Philip decided that the solution was to marry even more closely within the family. He married his niece, Anna of Austria, in a ceremony that was celebrated throughout the Spanish Empire as a triumph of royal purity. The wedding was magnificent, with celebrations lasting for weeks and diplomats from across Europe attending to witness the union of 2 branches of the mighty Habsburg tree. But behind the pageantry and political rhetoric, something horrifying was taking shape. The children of this marriage would carry genetic damage from both sides of their family, doubling down on harmful recessive traits that should have been diluted through marriage with unrelated partners. Anna of Austria was herself a product of Habsburg inbreeding, the daughter of Maximilian II and his wife Maria of Spain, who were first cousins. When Anna married her uncle Philip, the genetic coefficient, a measure of how closely related 2 parents are, reached levels that modern geneticists consider catastrophic for human reproduction. Their children would be the genetic equivalent of offspring from a brother-sister pairing. The results were immediate and devastating. Anna and Philip's first child, Ferdinand, died in infancy. Their second, Carlos, lived, but showed clear signs of severe developmental problems. Their third, Diego, died at the age of 7. Only one child, Philip III, survived to adulthood, and he carried with him a genetic load that would prove even more destructive in the next generation. Philip III ascended to the Spanish throne in 1598, inheriting not just the vast Habsburg territories, but also the family's growing obsession with genetic purity. By now, the physical signs of inbreeding were becoming impossible to ignore. Philip's jaw protruded so severely that he could not properly chew food, requiring his meals to be specially prepared and cut into tiny pieces. His speech was so distorted by his malformed mouth that foreign ambassadors often needed interpreters to understand what their host was saying. But the psychological effects were perhaps even more damaging than the physical ones. Generations of inbreeding had produced not just bodily deformities, but mental instabilities that made effective governance nearly impossible. Philip III was described by his own courtiers as childlike in his thinking, easily manipulated by advisors and incapable of making complex decisions. He became obsessed with religious rituals and spent hours each day in prayer, apparently believing that divine intervention could somehow reverse the genetic damage that centuries of Habsburg marriages had inflicted on his bloodline. The king's incapacity created a power vacuum that was filled by ambitious nobles who used Philip as a puppet for their own schemes. Spain, the richest and most powerful empire in the world, began to stagnate under the rule of a monarch who was physically and mentally incapable of leadership. Tax revenues declined as corruption spread throughout the government. Military defeats mounted as enemies recognized Spanish weakness. The golden age of Spanish power was ending, not because of external conquest or economic collapse, but because the ruling family had genetically engineered their own incompetence. Yet even as the evidence of genetic disaster mounted, the Habsburg obsession with pure blood only intensified. Philip III married Margaret of Austria, another first cousin, in a ceremony that was presented to the Spanish people as a celebration of Habsburg strength and purity. The propaganda surrounding the wedding emphasized the ancient bloodlines being united, the divine blessing on the Habsburg dynasty, and the promise of strong heirs who would restore Spanish greatness. The reality was far different. Margaret was herself a product of multiple generations of Habsburg inbreeding, and her marriage to Philip represented yet another doubling down on damaged genetics. Their children would carry an even heavier burden of genetic abnormalities, pushed further toward the biological breaking point that would finally be reached in the next generation. Margaret and Philip's son, the future Philip IV, was born in 1605 with physical deformities that shocked even the Habsburg-accustomed court physicians. His jaw protruded so severely that his lower teeth extended beyond his upper lip, even when his mouth was closed. His spine was curved, forcing him to walk with a pronounced hunch that made him appear smaller than his actual height. Most disturbing of all, his eyes had the vacant, unfocused look that court observers had learned to associate with Habsburg mental deficiencies. As Philip IV grew to adulthood, it became clear that the genetic damage was accelerating with each generation. What had been minor physical quirks in Charles V had become severe deformities in his great-great-grandson. The Habsburg jaw, which had started as a slight protrusion, was now so extreme that normal speech and eating were nearly impossible. The mental instabilities that had been manageable eccentricities in earlier generations had become full-blown cognitive disabilities that made effective rule impossible. But the most tragic aspect of Philip IV's condition was that he understood what was happening to his family. Unlike his predecessors who had lived in denial about their genetic deterioration, Philip was intelligent enough to recognize the pattern. He could see that each generation of Habsburgs was more damaged than the last, that the pure bloodline his ancestors had worked so hard to preserve was actually destroying itself from within. This knowledge filled Philip with a desperate urgency to produce healthy heirs, while there was still time to reverse the genetic spiral. He married his niece, Mariana of Austria, in yet another attempt to concentrate Habsburg blood, but this time with a difference. Philip understood that his family was running out of time, that perhaps one or two more generations remained before the Habsburg line would collapse entirely under the weight of its accumulated genetic damage. The wedding of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria in 1649 was the last great celebration of Habsburg genetic purity. The ceremonies lasted for months, with the elaborate pageants depicting the glory of the Habsburg bloodline and the divine blessing on their union. Poets composed verses celebrating the marriage of two streams of pure royal blood. Artists created paintings showing the couple surrounded by symbols of their ancient lineage. But even as the celebrations continued, observers noted disturbing signs. The bride, Mariana, was only 14 years old while her uncle husband was 44. She had been raised in virtual isolation, surrounded by courtiers who treated her more like a religious relic than a human being. Her education had focused entirely on preparing her for her role as a vessel for Habsburg genetics, with little attention paid to developing her intelligence or personality. The age gap between the couple was not unusual for royal marriages of the era, but in this case it represented something more sinister. Philip IV was not just marrying a young wife, he was marrying his own niece, a girl who carried the same genetic damage that had already produced two generations of increasingly deformed Habsburg heirs. Their children would represent the final stage of a genetic experiment that had been running for over 2 centuries. When Mariana gave birth to their first child in 1651, the court held its breath. Would this child break the pattern of Habsburg genetic decline? Or would it represent yet another step toward the biological catastrophe that seemed increasingly inevitable? The answer would determine not just the fate of the Spanish throne, but the future of European politics for generations to come. The child born to Philip IV and Mariana of Austria would be named Margaret Theresa, and from the moment she drew her first breath, it was clear that the Habsburg genetic experiment had entered its final phase. The infant's cries echoed through the marble corridors of the royal Alcazar, but they were not the healthy wails of a normal baby. They were weak, strained sounds that seemed to come from a creature already struggling against the biological burden she had inherited. Court physicians who examined the newborn princess found themselves documenting abnormalities that surpassed even their worst expectations. Margaret Theresa's skull was misshapen, elongated in some places and compressed in others, giving her head an almost alien appearance. Her jaw, even in infancy, showed signs of the extreme protrusion that had become the Habsburg family curse. Most disturbing of all, her limbs were weak and underdeveloped, suggesting that the genetic damage was now affecting basic motor function. But the physical deformities were only the beginning. As Margaret Theresa grew from infant to child, it became apparent that the Habsburg genetic collapse had reached her mind as well. She was slow to speak, slower to walk, and seemed to exist in a perpetual state of confusion that no amount of royal tutoring could overcome. The little girl who should have been the pride of the Spanish Empire was instead a living monument to 2 centuries of genetic self-destruction. The court artists commissioned to paint Margaret Theresa's portraits faced an impossible challenge. Royal protocol demanded that they portray the young princess as beautiful and healthy, suitable for the political marriages that would determine Spain's diplomatic future. But the reality of her appearance made such flattery nearly impossible. The surviving paintings from this period show the artist's desperate attempts to minimize her deformities through careful positioning and strategic use of shadows, but they could not entirely hide the truth of what Habsburg genetics had produced. Diego Velázquez, the greatest painter of the Spanish Golden Age, created several portraits of Margaret Theresa during her childhood. These masterpieces, now hanging in museums across Europe, are often admired for their technical brilliance and emotional depth. But art historians who study them closely can see something else: the careful way Velázquez positioned the young princess to minimize her physical abnormalities, the subtle techniques he used to suggest intelligence and vitality where little existed. In one particularly famous painting, Las Meninas, Velázquez depicted Margaret Theresa surrounded by her court attendants in what appears to be a moment of casual royal life. The princess stands at the center of the composition, dressed in an elaborate gown that was designed to mask her physical defects. But look closely at her face, and you can see the vacant expression, the slightly open mouth that reveals her malformed jaw, the eyes that seem to focus on nothing in particular. The painting has been analyzed by scholars for centuries, praised as one of the greatest works in the history of art. But it is also a documentary record of genetic catastrophe, a visual testament to what happens when political ambition overrides biological reality. Margaret Theresa was not posing for a portrait. She was serving as evidence in a criminal case against the very concept of royal inbreeding. As the young princess grew older, the full extent of her disabilities became impossible to conceal. She struggled with basic tasks that came naturally to other children. Walking was difficult due to her weak limbs and curved spine. Speaking was a constant challenge because of her malformed mouth and swollen tongue. Learning was nearly impossible because of cognitive deficits that seemed to worsen rather than improve with age. The Spanish court, which had once been the envy of Europe for its sophistication and cultural achievements, was now reduced to caring for a royal family that was literally falling apart. Teams of physicians, tutors, and attendants were assigned to Margaret Theresa, not to prepare her for queenly duties, but simply to help her survive from day to day. The empire that controlled vast territories in Europe and the Americas was being governed by regents and advisors because its royal family had become too genetically damaged to rule. But even as Margaret Theresa's condition deteriorated, the Habsburg obsession with genetic purity continued unabated. Negotiations began for her marriage while she was still a child, with various European princes being considered as potential husbands. The irony was cruel beyond measure. Here was a girl who could barely care for herself being discussed as breeding stock for the next generation of European royalty. The most serious marriage proposal came from her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. Leopold was himself a Habsburg, the product of the same inbred bloodlines that had produced Margaret Theresa's disabilities. The proposed union would represent yet another concentration of damaged genetics, virtually guaranteeing that any children would be even more severely affected than their parents. The marriage negotiations revealed the true depth of Habsburg delusion about their genetic condition. Rather than recognizing Margaret Theresa's disabilities as evidence that their breeding practices were catastrophically flawed, The family interpreted them as temporary setbacks that could be overcome through proper matches with other Habsburg relatives. They genuinely believed that marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, was somehow purifying their bloodline rather than destroying it. Contemporary documents from the Spanish court during this period make for disturbing reading. Letters between Habsburg relatives discuss Margaret Theresa's marriage prospects in terms that sound more like livestock breeding than human relationships. They analyze her genetic heritage, calculate the benefits of various matches, and debate which combination of Habsburg bloodlines might produce the strongest heirs. What none of these calculations took into account was the human cost of their genetic experiment. Margaret Theresa was not a breeding animal or a political chess piece. She was a child trapped in a body and mind that had been systematically destroyed by her ancestors' obsessions. Every day of her life was a struggle against disabilities that she had inherited through no fault of her own. The wedding of Margaret Theresa and Leopold took place in 1666, when she was 15 years old. The ceremony was held not in Spain but in Vienna, as the bride was too fragile to undertake the journey to her new home. Even the short trip from her quarters to the chapel required special arrangements with physicians standing by in case her weak constitution failed her during the stress of the wedding. Leopold himself was hardly a prize husband. At 26, he showed clear signs of Habsburg genetic damage, including the characteristic protruding jaw, digestive problems, and the mental instabilities that had become family traits. The marriage was less a union of two people than a collision of two sets of damaged genetics, with predictably tragic results. The wedding night was a disaster that shocked even the Habsburg-accustomed court physicians. Margaret Theresa's physical condition made normal marital relations impossible, while Leopold's own genetic abnormalities created additional complications. What should have been the consummation of a royal marriage instead became a medical emergency that required the intervention of doctors and the administration of powerful sedatives to both participants. The attempts to produce an heir from this union read like a medieval medical textbook on the consequences of extreme inbreeding. Margaret Theresa became pregnant several times, but each pregnancy ended in tragedy. Some ended in early miscarriages, others in stillbirths, and one produced a child so severely deformed that it survived only a few hours after birth. The court physicians who attended these failed pregnancies left behind clinical notes that provide a horrifying window into the final stages of Habsburg genetic collapse. They describe fetuses with multiple organ defects, bone abnormalities that made normal development impossible, and neurological problems so severe that the children could not have survived even if they had been carried to full term. Margaret Theresa herself grew weaker with each failed pregnancy. Her body, already compromised by genetic damage, could not withstand the repeated trauma of bearing children who were doomed from conception. She developed chronic health problems that left her bedridden for months at a time, attended by physicians who could do little more than manage her pain and watch her slow deterioration. The Spanish court received regular reports about the Empress's condition, and these documents reveal the growing desperation of a family that was beginning to understand the magnitude of their genetic catastrophe. References appear to consultations with foreign physicians, experiments with new medical treatments, and even consultations with practitioners of alternative medicine who promised to reverse the effects of inbreeding through herbal remedies and spiritual interventions. But no amount of medical intervention could overcome 2 centuries of genetic damage. Margaret Theresa died in 1673 at the age of 21, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated effects of Habsburg genetics. She left behind no living children, marking another step toward the complete extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line. Her death sent shockwaves through the European political system, not because anyone mourned the loss of a young woman, but because it brought the Spanish succession crisis one step closer to reality. The Habsburg Empire, which had seemed invincible for 2 centuries, was literally dying out due to its own genetic policies. The tragedy of Margaret Theresa's death was compounded by the fact that her younger brother had already shown signs of even more severe genetic damage. Philip Prospero, born in 1657, represented what physicians were beginning to recognize as the terminal stage of Habsburg genetic deterioration. From birth, it was clear that this child carried a genetic load so heavy that survival itself would be a daily struggle. Philip Prospero's condition surpassed even the most pessimistic expectations of court physicians who had grown accustomed to documenting Habsburg abnormalities. His head was grotesquely enlarged, a condition that modern medicine would recognize as hydrocephalus, caused by the accumulation of fluid in his brain. His limbs were so weak and underdeveloped that he could not support his own weight, requiring constant assistance from attendants who carried him from place to place like a living doll. The child's breathing was labored and irregular, punctuated by fits of coughing that left him gasping for air. His digestive system was so compromised that he could only consume liquids, and even these had to be carefully prepared and administered by physicians who monitored every swallow. Court records describe a child who seemed to exist in a constant state of medical crisis, teetering on the edge of death from the moment he drew his first breath. But perhaps most heartbreaking was Philip Prospero's apparent awareness of his own condition. Unlike some Habsburg children whose cognitive disabilities shielded them from understanding their circumstances, Philip Prospero possessed enough mental clarity to recognize that something was terribly wrong with his body. Court attendants reported that he would sometimes stare at his own hands with a look of confusion and fear, as if he couldn't understand why they wouldn't obey his commands. The child's brief life became a showcase for the most advanced medical knowledge of the 17th century, as Philip IV summoned physicians from across Europe in a desperate attempt to save his heir. Italian doctors brought new theories about blood circulation. German physicians proposed experimental surgical interventions, and French specialists offered revolutionary treatments involving mercury and other toxic substances that were believed to purify corrupted bloodlines. None of these treatments had any effect on Philip Prospero's condition, and many actually made his suffering worse. The mercury treatments left him with tremors and additional neurological problems. Surgical attempts to drain fluid from his brain resulted in infections that nearly killed him. Bloodletting, prescribed to remove corrupted humors from his system, left him so weak that he could barely remain conscious. The Spanish court during Philip Prospero's short life resembled a medieval hospital more than a royal palace. The sound of the child's labored breathing echoed through marble corridors that had once rang with laughter and music. The elaborate ceremonies and celebrations that had marked previous royal childhoods were replaced by hushed consultations between physicians and the constant presence of priests who were regularly summoned to administer last rites to a boy who seemed perpetually on the verge of death. Foreign ambassadors who visited the Spanish court during this period left behind diplomatic dispatches that reveal the growing international awareness of Habsburg genetic collapse. The Venetian ambassador wrote to his superiors that the Spanish royal family appeared to be cursed by God, producing children who were more dead than alive. The French representative reported that Philip Prospero looked more like a medical curiosity than a future king, and suggested that France should prepare for the inevitable extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line. These diplomatic reports were not merely gossipy observations about royal family problems. They represented serious intelligence gathering about the future of European politics. If the Spanish Habsburgs could no longer produce viable heirs, their vast empire would eventually pass to other branches of the family, or trigger succession wars that could reshape the continent. Every detail about Philip Prospero's condition was analyzed for its potential impact on international relations. Philip Prospero died in 1661 at the age of 4, his small body finally surrendering to the genetic damage that had made his life a constant struggle. His death was both expected and devastating, removing the last male heir to the Spanish throne and forcing Philip IV to confront the possibility that his dynasty might end with him. The king's reaction to his son's death revealed the full psychological impact of watching his family's genetic experiment collapse in real time. Courtiers described Philip IV as a broken man who spent hours staring at portraits of his deceased children, trying to understand how the bloodline he had worked so hard to preserve had become a source of such suffering. He began to exhibit signs of what modern psychology would recognize as severe depression, losing interest in governance and spending entire days in prayer. But even in his grief, Philip IV could not bring himself to abandon the Habsburg obsession with genetic purity. Instead of recognizing that inbreeding had killed his children, he convinced himself that their deaths were divine punishment for not being pure enough in their breeding practices. He began planning an even more extreme concentration of Habsburg genetics, determined to produce an heir so genetically concentrated that divine favor would finally return to his family. This delusion led to one of the most shocking decisions in the history of royal inbreeding. Philip IV, now in his 50s and having watched multiple children die from genetic defects, decided to marry his own niece's daughter. The proposed bride was Mariana of Austria's sister, a girl so closely related to the king that their potential children would have a genetic coefficient approaching that of offspring from a father-daughter pairing. The negotiations for this marriage horrified even the Habsburg-accustomed European courts. The Pope initially refused to grant the dispensation necessary for such a closely related union, and several Spanish nobles quietly expressed concerns about the wisdom of concentrating Habsburg genetics even further. But Philip IV was determined to proceed, convinced that only through the most extreme genetic purity could his family reclaim divine blessing. The wedding never took place, prevented not by moral concerns or papal intervention, but by Philip IV's own death in 1665. The king died believing that he had failed his dynasty by not concentrating their genetics sufficiently, never understanding that his family's obsession with purity had been the source of their destruction all along. Philip's death left the Spanish throne to his only surviving child, a daughter whose very existence represented both hope and terror for the Habsburg dynasty. This was the Infanta Maria Theresa, who had somehow survived the genetic catastrophe that had killed her siblings, but who carried within her DNA the accumulated damage of centuries of inbreeding. Her future would determine whether the Spanish Habsburgs could somehow recover from their genetic experiment, or whether they would follow their German cousins into complete extinction. Maria Theresa's survival to adulthood was considered miraculous by court physicians who had grown accustomed to watching Habsburg children die in infancy. But her apparent health masked genetic damage that would become apparent only when she attempted to fulfill her royal duty of producing heirs. The Spanish succession now depended entirely on this young woman's ability to overcome the biological legacy of her ancestors' choices. The pressure placed on Maria Theresa's shoulders was enormous. She was not just a princess expected to make a good political marriage. She was the last hope of a dynasty that had ruled half the world for 2 centuries. Every aspect of her life was scrutinized for signs that she might be able to break the pattern of genetic failure that had consumed her family. Marriage negotiations for Maria Theresa began when she was still a child, with European courts calculating the genetic implications of various matches. The French court, led by the ambitious Louis XIV, saw an opportunity to claim the Spanish inheritance through marriage. The Austrian Habsburgs pushed for a match that would keep the Spanish territories within the family. Other powers maneuvered for positions that would benefit them when the Spanish Empire inevitably fragmented. What none of these calculations fully considered was the human cost of treating Maria Theresa as a genetic experiment rather than a person. Like her Habsburg ancestors, she was being reduced to her reproductive potential, valued only for her ability to produce heirs that might somehow overcome 2 centuries of accumulated genetic damage. The young woman who should have been preparing for queenly duties was instead being prepared for what everyone understood might be a final attempt to save a dying bloodline. The marriage that was eventually arranged for Maria Theresa would determine not just her personal fate, but the future of European politics for generations to come. The choice of husband would either provide the Spanish Habsburgs with one last chance at genetic recovery, or would represent the final step in a process of genetic destruction that had been building for over 200 years. As negotiations continued and European powers positioned themselves for the eventual Spanish succession crisis, one thing was becoming clear to observers across the continent. The Habsburg genetic experiment was approaching its end, and the consequences would reshape the political map of Europe in ways that no one could fully predict. The dynasty that had once seemed invincible was about to discover the ultimate price of their obsession with keeping bloodlines pure. Maria Theresa's marriage to Louis XIV of France in 1660 should have represented a new beginning for Habsburg genetics. Here was a chance to introduce fresh bloodlines into a dynasty that had been slowly poisoning itself for generations. Louis was young, healthy, and came from a family that had practiced strategic marriages across Europe, rather than the systematic inbreeding that had destroyed the Habsburgs. The wedding ceremony was a spectacular affair that seemed to herald a new era of Spanish-French cooperation. The young bride appeared healthy and beautiful, showing few of the obvious physical deformities that had marked her Habsburg relatives. Diplomats and observers breathed sighs of relief, believing that perhaps the worst of the genetic damage had been avoided in this generation. But appearances can be deceiving, especially when generations of genetic damage lie hidden in recessive genes, waiting for the right combination to express themselves. Maria Theresa carried within her DNA the accumulated mutations and deletions that had been building in the Habsburg bloodline since the family first began their experiment in genetic concentration. These defects might remain dormant in her own body, but they would inevitably appear in her children when combined with genetic material from her husband. The French court initially celebrated Maria Theresa as a conquest, both political and genetic. They saw her marriage to Louis as proof that French vitality could overcome Spanish decadence, that the healthy Bourbon bloodline would revitalize the corrupted Habsburg genetics. Court physicians made optimistic predictions about the strong heirs that would emerge from this union of French vigor and Spanish royal blood. These predictions proved tragically wrong. Maria Theresa's first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage that shocked the French court with its violence and duration. Her second pregnancy produced a son, but the child died within hours of birth, his tiny body showing clear signs of the genetic abnormalities that had plagued Habsburg infants for generations. Subsequent pregnancies followed the same pattern, with most ending in miscarriage or infant death. The few children who did survive past infancy carried visible signs of their Habsburg heritage. The Dauphin, who lived to adulthood, showed the characteristic jaw protrusion that had become synonymous with Habsburg genetics. He suffered from chronic health problems that French physicians attributed to his Spanish blood, and his own reproductive history would be marked by the same pattern of failed pregnancies and sickly children that had characterized his mother's lineage. French court records from this period reveal growing concern about what they termed the Spanish contamination of the Bourbon bloodline. Physicians began recommending that future royal marriages avoid Spanish partners entirely, recognizing that the Habsburg genetic damage was too extensive to be overcome through simple outcrossing. The political alliance that the marriage was supposed to cement was gradually undermined by the biological reality of what Habsburg genetics had become. Maria Theresa herself became increasingly isolated within the French court as her reproductive failures mounted. She was no longer seen as a valuable addition to the Bourbon family, but as a genetic liability whose presence threatened the dynasty's future. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she spent hours in prayer begging for divine intervention to overcome what she believed was a curse upon her bloodline. The Spanish succession crisis that had been building for decades finally exploded when Charles II died childless in 1700. The last Spanish Habsburg had been so severely damaged by inbreeding that he was unable to produce even a single heir despite multiple marriages. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would consume Europe for over a decade and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But the true tragedy was not the war itself, but what it represented. The Spanish Empire, which had been built through centuries of Habsburg marriages, was now being torn apart because those same marriages had made the family incapable of governing or reproducing. The strategy that had once made the Habsburgs the most powerful dynasty in Europe had ultimately led to their complete extinction. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg family, meanwhile, was following a similar trajectory toward genetic collapse. They had maintained their territories through the same inbreeding practices that had destroyed their Spanish cousins, and the results were becoming increasingly apparent with each generation. The Holy Roman Empire, the oldest continuous political institution in Europe, was being governed by emperors whose genetic damage made effective rule nearly impossible. Leopold I, who had married Margaret Theresa in that tragic union we discussed earlier, represented the Austrian Habsburg pattern of genetic deterioration. His massive jaw made speech difficult, his chronic health problems left him weak and frequently bedridden, and his mental instabilities created diplomatic crises that his advisors spent years trying to resolve. Yet even as his own condition demonstrated the catastrophic effects of inbreeding, Leopold continued the family tradition by marrying his niece in a second union that produced children even more damaged than those from his first marriage. The pattern repeated with each generation. Sons who could barely govern inherited thrones they were genetically unfit to occupy. Daughters who should have been valuable marriage partners became genetic liabilities that other royal families sought to avoid. The Habsburg territories began to fragment as local nobles recognized that their Habsburg overlords were no longer capable of effective leadership. Charles VI, the last male Habsburg ruler, spent his entire reign trying to ensure that his daughter, Maria Theresa, would inherit his territories intact. The pragmatic sanction that he promulgated was intended to prevent the kind of succession crisis that had torn apart the Spanish Empire, but it couldn't address the underlying problem that the Habsburg bloodline had become so genetically compromised that effective rule was nearly impossible. Maria Theresa herself was more capable than most of her Habsburg relatives, but she still carried the genetic load that had accumulated over centuries of inbreeding. Her children showed clear signs of Habsburg abnormalities, and her attempts to arrange marriages for them revealed how reluctant other royal families had become to associate their bloodlines with Habsburg genetics. The final chapters of the Habsburg genetic experiment played out across multiple generations of increasingly damaged rulers who struggled to govern territories that were slowly slipping from their control. Each marriage within the family added to the genetic burden. Each generation produced children less capable than their parents. Each decade brought the dynasty closer to the biological extinction that had already claimed their Spanish cousins. The scientific revolution that was transforming European thought during this period provided new ways to understand what was happening to the Habsburg bloodline. Physicians began to recognize patterns in the family's medical history that suggested hereditary transmission of defects. Natural philosophers started to theorize about the mechanisms by which parental characteristics were passed to children. But this emerging knowledge came too late to save a dynasty that had already passed the point of genetic recovery. The Habsburg story serves as one of history's most complete case studies in the consequences of systematic inbreeding. No other royal family maintained such detailed medical records over such an extended period, while consistently practicing such extreme genetic concentration. The result is a unique window into what happens when political ambition overrides biological reality for multiple generations. Modern genetic analysis of Habsburg remains has confirmed what contemporary physicians could only observe empirically. The family's DNA shows clear evidence of the genetic bottlenecking that occurs when closely related individuals reproduce repeatedly over many generations. Harmful recessive alleles that should have remained rare became fixed in the population. Beneficial genetic variations were lost through random drift. The genetic diversity that provides resilience against disease and developmental problems was systematically eliminated. The Habsburg jaw, which became the family's most visible genetic marker, was just the tip of the iceberg. Modern medical knowledge allows us to identify dozens of other conditions that plagued the family. Immune system deficiencies that made them vulnerable to infections, hormonal imbalances that affected growth and development, neurological problems that impaired cognitive function, and reproductive disorders that made successful pregnancies increasingly rare. Perhaps most tragically, the Habsburg genetic experiment was entirely preventable. At multiple points during their long decline, the family could have introduced fresh bloodlines that would have restored genetic health within a few generations. Other royal families that practiced more moderate inbreeding recovered successfully when they recognized the problems it was causing. But the Habsburgs' obsession with genetic purity blinded them to the mounting evidence that their breeding practices were destroying the very bloodline they sought to preserve. The dynasty that once ruled a territory spanning 4 continents ultimately fell not to military conquest or political revolution, but to the inexorable logic of genetics. They had turned their children into victims of an experiment that prioritized abstract concepts of blood purity over human welfare. Generation after generation paid the price for their ancestors' delusions about genetic superiority. As you stand once again in that throne room in Vienna, looking upon the broken form of Charles II, you understand that you are witnessing more than the end of a dynasty. You are seeing the final result of what happens when power becomes disconnected from wisdom, when tradition becomes more important than truth, and when political ideology overrides biological reality. The Habsburgs believed they were creating a master race of genetically superior rulers. Instead, they created a genetic wasteland that consumed their children and ultimately destroyed their empire. Their story stands as an eternal warning about the dangers of confusing political power with genetic destiny, and about the terrible price that innocent children pay when adults mistake their prejudices for scientific truth. The marble halls that once echoed with the footsteps of the most powerful rulers in Europe now stand silent, monuments to a dynasty that forgot the most basic truth about human genetics. That strength comes from diversity, not purity. The Habsburg experiment in genetic concentration was not just a failure, it was a crime against their own descendants, and its consequences echoed through European politics for centuries after the last Habsburg king drew his labored final breath. In the end, the family that sought to make their blood eternal succeeded only in making it extinct.